Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another CEN seminar. So today we are very, very pleased to welcome Gavin Buckingham, who is going to be telling us about co-creating research with dyspraxic children. Really interesting topic. Can't wait to hear more. So just to tell you a little bit about Gavin, he was awarded his PhD in psychology from the University of Aberdeen in 2008. And his topic was examining attention in the context of hand preferences. Following the completion of his PhD, he moved to Canada to take up a position as a postdoctoral fellow in the Brain and Mind Institute at Western University in Canada, working with Professor Mel Goodale. And his work here mostly focused on how we perceive weight and interact with objects in the world around us. Then in February 2016, he joined the Department for Sport and Health Sciences at the University of Exeter, where he is an associate professor and leads the Object Interaction Lab. So I'll now hand over to Gavin and can't wait to hear more about this incredibly interesting topic.
Well, thank you very much, Astrid, for the lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for coming along today. I'm Gavin. I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, interested in how people pick things up. But since moving to Exeter, I have become kind of dragged into the world of virtual reality, and this has really been a big driving force underpinning my research program in recent years. And I'm going to present today some work that has been, I suppose, very much ongoing, a continuation of some of the work that I presented last time I gave a talk for the SEN back in 2021, and is definitely not finished either. So I'd be super happy to hear your views, opinions, thoughts on directions on where to go. And yeah, hopefully this will give you an insight into not just the research, but also the I guess change in philosophy I've had over the past few years around incorporating end user views in the development of my scientific process. Not some epiphany I've had, but some have my eyes opened by some really talented trainees. All right, so on with the talk itself. So this talk is about developmental coordination disorder, which is either known as DCD or dyspraxia. I'm going to be using the two terms dyspraxic, children with developmental coordination disorder, fairly arbitrarily and randomly, switching between the two, reflecting the fact that we've done a little bit of survey work and there's a pretty wide variety in how individuals with developmental coordination disorder prefer to be called. So I get to sidestep quite neatly that person first language debate, I would say. For those of you that haven't come across it before, developmental coordination disorder is a condition that affects children. It's chronic. Children are born with it, and is marked by a clear motor impairment that will hinder their participation in a range of daily activities. So a typical dyspraxic child might have challenges riding a bike or playing football as well as their peers, or doing things like holding a pencil to write, or tying knots in their shoes and things like that. It's quite a diverse etiology. It's pretty rare that dyspraxic children have a wide-ranging inability to do anything motor control. It seems to be quite a lumpy profile. It affects a surprising number of children. We're talking somewhere between 5 to 6% of school-age children, as far as the latest numbers go. And that means, you will almost certainly have a dyspraxic child, or know a dyspraxic child, or know a parent or carer of a dyspraxic child. Children with developmental coordination disorder, usually as a consequence of their impairments in motor control, will tend to be engaged less in play with their peers and spend more time in the playground alone. And you can kind of imagine the knock-on consequences that has for, being picked last in the team and not wanting to engage in this incredibly key aspect of development that has been shown to have pretty long-term social, emotional, and behavioral consequences that extend far past their educational journey later on into their lives. It often co-occurs with disorders like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder as well. And those more, I suppose, well-known issues will often mask the diagnosis of developmental coordination disorder, or at the very least put it at the back of the queue as far as interventions and accommodations are concerned. So I've been working with dyspraxic children for probably about 6 years now, since I got a grant from the Waterloo Foundation back in 2019. In this grant, I had dyspraxic children pick up objects and I was measuring their grip forces. Some of you who have been around for a while and maybe saw that talk the last time might remember this slide. I'm not going to present any of this work today. I mean, if you really want to go back and hear all of that stuff, I suppose I could dig it out of the archives. But what I really want to do is talk about the follow-on work that came after this, because once I had collected all of this data with the dyspraxic children, I was awarded funding from a data science institute at the University of Exeter, where I was able to work with one of my PhD students, Jack Evans, to develop some machine learning techniques to understand the motor skill and motor patterns of dyspraxic children. But alongside that, I was also given a big pile of money to engage in patient and public involvement work, so PPI. And this was not a term I had engaged with at all at this point. And, handily enough, I was um, offered slash told that I need to go on many training courses and engage with this and engage with the working group that this internal institution had developed around PPI. And this had really sort of totally changed my outlook on how this kind of research should be going. The pandemic, of course, got largely in the way of all of this, but became quite an interesting opportunity, actually, because while we were certainly not able to get people into the lab, we were definitely able to engage people in online talks and presentations, and probably we reach a far wider audience than we might otherwise have been able to had we been stuck with the default of people being in person for their interactions. We also took the opportunity to spend some of this PPI money on a bunch of virtual reality headsets. What you see here is the Oculus Quest 2, now called the Meta Quest 2, which during the pandemic really had a bit of a heyday and was bought by almost everybody who wanted to put something on their face and escape the dystopian reality of Boris Johnson's briefings while they could, enjoy playing Beat Saber or sitting on a roller coaster or something like that. What we wanted to do is get a sense of whether dyspraxic children would enjoy engaging with virtual reality, because we had a sense that this could be a really interesting way to not just move the diagnostic picture forward a little bit, but also to start to engage dyspraxic children in physical activity in a way that was perhaps a little bit less socially valenced. So we sent some of these VR headsets to the parents of dyspraxic children and let them play with them for a couple of weeks in whatever way they saw fit, and then interviewed them afterwards. I won't talk in any great detail about the outgoing interviews, but we got a few little interesting quotes, So when people opened the box for the first time, they were excited and they thought it looked really great. And delivering a VR headset to a slice of society that maybe wouldn't necessarily get access to something like this was really great, right? Really, really exciting. Now this world has kind of moved on now, and I think many people have tried and kind of given up on virtual reality in their own houses, but this was very much at the beginning of that kind of wave. From this feedback, we got some really interesting comments, particularly around diagnosis. Here we have one parent saying, "I can only see it as positive. My child found the process he's had to go through for his diagnosis pretty stressful. If it was all through games, not in a clinical setting, that would be amazing, maybe even fun." Now, this quote I plucked straight out of the PPI and stuck it straight into my next grant application, which we were subsequently awarded to develop a VR screening tool for virtual reality. And this is what I'm going to present here today, the development of that screening tool. Now, why do we need a new screening tool? How is this disorder dealt with in the first place? Well, it's, I would say, pretty lumpy. There's a parental filled out survey that's the most common starting point for a diagnosis of developmental coordination disorder. This is called the DCDQ, 15-item questionnaire, and pretty well normed, and very quick and easy to fill out, and really does the job very well. But it's a parental survey and has the obvious downsides that one might imagine. Then, on the other side of the spectrum, the formal diagnosis of developmental coordination disorder in the UK, at least, is typically done through a battery of tests called the Movement ABC, which was developed by Henderson back in 2007. And this is used by occupational therapists and physiotherapists and occasionally GPs, although not really very commonly, at least in my part of the country. Usually the diagnosis is undertaken in a school setting, and usually for children who are greater than 5 years old. This has been normed and validated in its newest version all the way up to 16-year-olds. Yeah, it's typically done more around the ages of 5, 6, 7, but it takes quite a long time. It's 8, I guess, rather clunky seeming tests. A plastic pegboard task, balancing on a balance beam, throwing a ball off a wall, and counting how long and how many catches the child is able to make with 2 different or 3 different levels of difficulty to somewhat scale it by age and make it appropriate for different age groups. But it is pretty time consuming to do. It will take at best probably 40 minutes to administer this test. With a child who's not that interested in engaging with the tasks, it can take over an hour, up to 2 hours sometimes. The tasks are not very fun, and that's often the nature of diagnostic tools. They are, meant to be kind of stressing the system and find the breaking point. But as such, dyspraxic children don't like them, and many dyspraxic adults have not very fond memories of engaging with this in their teenage years. It's also quite hard to train people to do this. It's not particularly complicated to roll out, but it is a fairly convoluted series of steps and things that need to be done in a certain order that requires a fairly large room, often a gymnasium or something like that. And it's expensive. It costs about £1,200 for a Movement ABC kit, which comes in a nice suitcase or a nice briefcase, but is not cheap, and certainly not the sort of thing that every school would have access to. By contrast, virtual reality has a very nice narrative around it, around being engaging. It's it's fun, it's new, it's strange, it's interesting. Perhaps a bit more relevant for a scientific perspective than that, though. What a virtual reality headset is doing is it is essentially a motion tracking system inside a box. It is measuring the position usually of handheld controllers and the position of a headset as the person moves around the environment at somewhere between 60 and 100 hertz with reasonably high precision. So this all of a sudden becomes potentially a huge step in terms of the subjectivity of the Movement ABC and the DCDQ survey to a potentially more objective measurement tool. And we're certainly nowhere near quantifying that objectivity, the movements that we can capture and the things that we would consider a good skill. That gap is really quite large, but this is a step towards closing that gap, I would say. Children also find virtual reality quite non-stressful, particularly if the right things are delivered to them. You've got a thing on your face, the outside world is going around, and certainly my kids really are able to lose themselves in this. And there's emerging evidence as well that various different other neuroatypicalities, such as autism and ADHD, really feel like they thrive in these more tech settings. So it's potentially quite a resource efficient, accessible approach, which really does fly in the face of what maybe 5 years ago we would have been saying about virtual reality, which maybe it's a great idea but far too expensive. Now a Meta Quest 2 headset would be about £200, considerably cheaper than a smartphone and certainly cheaper than even 6 Movement ABC kits. So we made this case to the Waterloo Foundation, who are a charitable organization who fund a lot of the work that's been done with dyspraxic children in the past 20 years or so. to develop and validate a virtual reality screening tool that would be useful for helping to identify children with developmental coordination disorder. Now, we thought long and hard about what age group we were going to work with on this, had a bit of back and forth with the reviewers. We settled on children aged 11 to 16. This was not really due to safety concerns about the virtual reality headsets per se, but more to the ergonomics. If you have a small head, a virtual reality headset simply does not fit on top of you very well. There are concerns, I suppose, that many people do have around the developing visual system, but I think any ethical issues around that will be traded off against the potential benefits of developing an effective diagnostic tool. We did all of the work with the view to developing a lab-based assessment. So certainly not the end goal of developing something that really could be rolled out in a more dramatic and interesting way at a school or even home level. We thought we'd aim a little bit lower and work in a lab where we can have control over the lighting conditions and get to use a virtual reality headset that's a little bit more expensive with some slightly more impressive tracking abilities, because we thought this was the sensible first step. Now, what we needed to do this project was someone who could develop in Unity and work with children. And, this is a bit of a unicorn problem. And we put the job out to advertise 3 times before we found our unicorn, Hao Yang Du, who is now a PhD student at the Technical University Dublin. Fantastic guy who really deserves all the credit for all the stuff I'm going to be presenting here today. Did an incredible job with this project, and it definitely would not have gone forward without his energies and efforts and his talents, not just as a virtual reality developer, but as a football coach of young children who'd really been, able to motivate kids into doing stuff well and listening to them about what worked and what didn't work. Because really a huge part of the narrative around this was engaging with dyspraxic children so that we could develop a tool that felt authentic to that group. Before, though, we had to do a little bit of a mapping exercise because you can't just sit down with a bunch of dyspraxic children and ask them what would make a good tool. We felt that would just not be a useful starting point to the conversation. So first of all, we sort of did a bit of a sit down and a mapping about what is in the movement ABC and what can we do in virtual reality. We know that in virtual reality, we can do things well, like measure the balance. We're measuring the position of a headset on someone's head. We can measure the movements of the arms in pretty large movements with pretty high accuracy. We can't measure the fingertips or the fine dexterity in virtual reality very well at all. And we can't measure things like the feet. It's really just the hands that we had access to. Although there are technologies to measure foot in virtual reality, but we felt that might be a little unwieldy. And then we engaged after the alpha development of our tool in some fairly lengthy patient and public involvement. And I'll be presenting this in a rather linear fashion, but you can rest assured it was a fairly circular thing. We initially worked with what we would consider an expert, and this was in fact the researcher from my previous Waterloo Grant funded project, Kate Allen, who had worked with and collected data from 60 or so dyspraxic children in a fairly boring experimental task. So she had seen pretty much every variation in the sort of quirks of this particular child population. So particularly issues around their attention span and stuff, she was very keen and able to engage with. She wasn't an expert in virtual reality, but we felt we kind of had that expertise covered with Hao Yang and his expertise in developing games for children. And we also did a lot of work with the target population. We were initially working with 4 neurotypical children who were a bit younger than our target population, my kids actually, and a couple of kids of my friends who are pretty savvy with virtual reality, who have used VR headsets a lot, but were able to talk about what they enjoyed doing and whether this felt like fun from the perspective of a child. Then we allowed 5 dyspraxic children with their parents to come along and try out the things that we'd developed. And that was done fairly iteratively, one at a time, with changing things, improving things, rather than as a single focus group. We also got some feedback from two dyspraxic adults who we found at the university who were working there, who had very strong feelings about you know what this stuff was like when they were a kid, and they were super super excited to be involved in this research. And on Twitter, we were, I would say, sort of inexplicably lucky to get in touch with a dyspraxic VR video game designer as well, who again felt very, very keen to help. And we were able to just send him our builds of things, and he could give us feedback on them on his own VR headset. So that was a really great and certainly not planned, not written into the grant interaction. So I was really, really happy with how all of this sort of panned out. It looked kind of as good as it possibly could have from a developmental point of view. And we spent 6 months engaging in this process of developing, changing stuff, getting people in to try it out, making it better, saying fixing the thing we fixed didn't actually make it better in the way that we thought it would, and rolling it back. It's a very, very sort of iterative linear process, but spending literally half the grant developing with our target population the thing that we were going to test made the actual validation of it seem like a bit of an afterthought almost. So generally speaking, and I'll show you the games as we go along, so this might seem a little bit abstract, but the first key feedback we got, generally speaking, from Kate, our expert researcher with a lot of experience with dyspraxic children, was that anyone who puts on a VR headset for the first time is going to need a lot of practice and a lot of opportunity to get over that initial desire to just look around and mess around and try stuff out in VR, because plenty of kids have not been in VR ever. We're finding this is changing quite a lot actually, and now we're really struggling to recruit people for who are VR naive, which is quite an interesting change in the ecosystem. But we threw in plenty of practice trials and didn't make them optional. Children or all participants had to take part in practice trials for all games and all conditions. And all of the games we created had multiple trials, so we could record their best performance in each one of these trials. And this was the sort of general principle we went for here. We weren't averaging across a bunch of trials. We weren't just giving people one trial and recording how long they took. Make them do it a few times, taking their best performance, all balanced off with how boring the task itself was, so how much we felt we had liability to repeat it over and over again. All right, so on to the games themselves. The first game was a coin collection game, and one of the most reliable issues in DCD is fine motor control. This is typically assessed in the movement ABC through a posting coin task, where these little plastic coins are put out on the table and the kid has to pick them up with their hand and post them through the box. Pretty challenging to do under time pressure, pretty frustrating, pretty hard to implement in virtual reality as well. Our initial version of this task was really far too simplistic because you've got to use the controller to reach out and grab. So squeeze the controller and let go of it to drop it in there. It's not quite measuring dexterity in the same sort of way. We have no index of that skill of finger thumb opposition. It's really about the arm movement and getting the arm in the right place. So we really had to ramp up the difficulty of that aspect a little bit more. We did this by introducing different shapes of coins and different shapes of holes that were corresponding on the box. Anyone with children in a room will probably recognize this sort of fairly classic thing that you've had to endure your child doing, or watch them put the star through every single hole in a slightly frustrating kind of way. And this is what the task itself ended up looking like. So here the participant is reaching out, they're putting all the stars in there. They can do this in any order they want. The only thing that they're told to do is which hand they have to perform this with, because we had them perform the task with their dominant and their non-dominant hand. And from this, we were able to measure their raw movement kinematics, so the positions of their hands over time, but perhaps more importantly, some fairly more obvious criteria: the number of coins they collected, the time they spent completing each trial, the distance their hand moved overall. Now, our PPI helped us refine this task pretty dramatically. We found that certainly children were spending quite a lot of time dropping the coins because the physics were not very effective, and children were not really able to engage with this in quite the same way. So Hao Yang spent a lot of time actually working with some physics engines to make sure that the physics of the objects matched a little bit more the reality. Children had the opportunity to throw these things around in the practice trials before they started the real experiment, but it meant that when they dropped them, they were no longer on a sort of, panic footing about these things are not acting like they should, looking like they're sort of being sucked into the table by magnets. We also were keen to get children's performance with their dominant and their non-dominant hand. However, we were finding that kids were, doing lots of wacky different things, right? If you give them the opportunity to pass from one hand to the other, they're going to do that. And, I think working with your non-dominant hand to do a task, especially involved reaching across your body, is something that children will try to avoid doing if they possibly can, because it feels like hard work. So what we ended up having to do was a rather simple manipulation of disabling the hand that was not going to be able to be used. So it was still there, it was still being tracked, but they couldn't pick up the objects. And children learned pretty quickly through this, I would say, implicit tool that this is how they have to complete the task. Our second game was a maze tracing game. This is another one that is meant to really capture some of the aspects of handwriting, something that's pretty difficult to do in virtual reality in any meaningful sort of way, but perhaps capturing more the feel of a whiteboard task. In the movement ABC, children have to follow a trail with a pencil, going from beginning to end while staying inside the lines there, and the time they take to complete this is being captured with a stopwatch. This we were pretty easily able to do, but we spent quite a lot of time thinking about whether we wanted this to be on a table as well or in three-dimensional space without a surface to brush upon. And that's what we ultimately ended up with. Still not entirely sure it was the right choice. One of the big challenges about working in virtual reality is the fact that you get no tactile feedback of your contact with surfaces. And that does make the task really quite challenging. But it did allow us to get a really good insight into the accuracy in a very detailed kind of way, especially the accuracy in the X and Y planes about how well children completed this task, in addition to the more sort of classic measures of the speed. Pretty fun and engaging game to do. This is sort of from one of our earlier builds here, and you can kind of immediately see the problem that people are having here. They're struggling with the third dimension. How far into this virtual paper that there is nothing stopping them going through do they go in? At what point does the maze start to be traced? And children found it immensely frustrating at first. And it was also quite tiring because they were having to spend way too long getting that right and going a bit too slowly. So we ultimately worked to make this task a little bit easier in two different ways. First of all, we increased this threshold distance, so how close you got to the paper before it started drawing that purple line. And we also just shrunk it down. Again, a pretty simple manipulation, but I think when you're working with an adult, developing something with an adult-sized body, it's very easy to forget that children's-sized bodies are quite a bit smaller and they can reach a bit less far. And when they have to reach further, they're doing something really fundamentally quite different and reaching over, and their arms are getting tired and they're getting bored. So simple manipulation, but a very effective one that had a huge impact on children's enjoyment of this task. There was also some confusion about when things were actually starting. So we put a timer on there. We gave children a chance to sit and draw and get used to the pen on a sort of virtual bit of paper before the maze started. We didn't get them practice the maze per se, but we let them practice using the pen. And then we made it very clear that there was a timer on there and draw super fast, draw super well. And this did seem to keep people on task pretty well. Our third game out of the four that we developed was a table tennis game because gross motor function, and particularly a focus on an impairment with ball skills, is a key component of developmental coordination disorder. To this end, we developed a table tennis game. Table tennis sort of sits quite nicely in the space between something that virtual reality can do quite well, and there's a very good virtual reality table tennis game that we can model on. That the world of sports science reasonably well understands what good table tennis performance looks like from a measuring the kinematics perspective. So we had our participants hit a ball that was fired towards them towards an illuminated goal. And we were then capturing the number of goals that they successfully scored, but also the speed with which they moved their hand, and again, the hand path length. Pretty simple kind of stuff, probably the most fun of all the tasks. Everyone kind of uniformly enjoyed this and was able to succeed at it, which was a kind of a really key narrative underpinning the whole game, right? You shouldn't feel like you're failing at any of the tasks. Now, initially, we only had people do this with their preferred hand, underpinning this narrative of, feeling like you're going to do well at the task. But we did modify it in the end to make sure that we could capture both dominant and non-dominant hand performance. And that was actually not as frustrating as we imagined it would be. It's quite fun to fail at a table tennis task when this thing bounces towards you, and you can laugh about it. There's not such a frustration element that we'd initially envisaged there would be. But we did initially make the game far, far too challenging. The first initial build of this, the ball was coming at people really, really too fast. And, it sort of felt quite good for me and for Hao Yang, but we're both pretty accomplished table tennis players. And most of our sample had really not engaged with table tennis in any meaningful kind of way before. So we decreased the speed, we made the ball a bit bigger, and we put this nice trail effect as well that followed the ball here that just made everything that little bit easier from a number of different perspectives, and did find that sweet spot between it sort of being something that we could measure in a controlled and sensible kind of way, but a fun task nonetheless. And the last game we developed was a ski balance game. Again, this was plucked directly from the movement ABC, based on the pretty common finding that children with DCD have fairly poor postural control. So when they're standing up straight, they tend to wobble over a little bit and are not big fans of standing with their eyes closed, for example, on one leg. Now, Hao Yang was super keen to develop a skiing game. I think a bit of this was for his own profile. He wanted to do something a little bit more ambitious and dynamic, but also there was some nice evidence from a Wii Sports skiing game that children with DCD had, poorer performance than typically developing children. So this was quite a deviation from the movement ABC, but there was a body of literature on there that we wanted to build from, and we were pretty confident in the ability of the VR headset to measure balance stability. There have been some pretty good validation work of the VR headsets in this regard already done in the past few years. So the way we did it was that we had participants calibrate the gain on the skiing game. So they would have to stand still and we can measure how much they would sway, and then we used them to move their head to turn while they were skiing, which looked a little bit like this. So you can see how Yang really sort of went to town on the graphics of this. It's, a fully formed virtual reality game that he could be making money from probably. And the child is steering here by tilting their head to the left and to the right. So, nice idea in theory, disaster in practice. Children would sway their heads violently, they would fall over, they would fail in this task in catastrophic ways. They would fall off the edge of the world in ways that did not seem possible from the programming perspective. And it made our adults, not any of our children, interestingly, but several of our adult testers feel really quite ill. This is almost a virtual reality sickness simulator when done in the small sample of adults that we tried this in. And I certainly was not a big fan of doing it either. So what we did actually was took away the skiing phase entirely. We focused on this standing initial calibration phase where participants had to stand with their legs side by side or in a tandem stance with their left foot forward or their right foot forward, and simply measured the standard deviation of their balance over that period of calibration. The skiing part that Hao Yang spent a whole load of time on was turned into essentially a bonus optional extra to finish off the experience if children wanted to. So we sort of disguised the assessment, if you like, in that sense. And actually, that was quite a nice thing to do because standing balance is a fairly easy dependent variable to capture. Performance on a skiing game, that felt like a challenging thing. All right, so those are the games, those are the journey. And we validated this stuff. I'm not particularly interested in presenting great details about the validation, not least because this analysis is still kind of ongoing, but we had a pretty ambitious validation plan. We told the Waterloo Foundation would recruit 30, I think 32 dyspraxic children and 32 typically developing control children. We accounted for a bunch of dropouts because we thought this was probably going to be a pretty challenging thing. But actually, we had very few dropouts and got a much bigger sample than we expected to. The big problem with virtual reality experiments that you can probably see here is the massive gender imbalance, particularly with dyspraxic children. There's a ongoing debate about whether there are more dyspraxic boys than dyspraxic girls, or whether it's simply that people don't care all that much about whether a girl is not able to play sports all that well. That's a sort of bigger societal question from here, but our fairly well matched gender balance in typically developing girls. We weren't close to able to match in our dyspraxic sample. And yeah, this is one of the real challenges about working in the virtual reality ecosystem. Generally speaking, it seems that the parents of young boys are pretty keen to sign their kids up for VR experiments, but the parents of young girls are less keen. So we're going to do some more targeted recruitment from perhaps some local girls' schools in future iterations of these kinds of projects. We had them come in and complete the movement ABC2, this gold standard assessment, so that we could confirm that they were dyspraxic or typically developing. And then we had them complete our VR assessment, which they were able to complete all 4 games in under 20 minutes. We then simply compared their performance on a bunch of different metrics, 67 that we had automatically extracted from the virtual reality headset. We also captured all of the kinematics as well, but we have no plans to use all that yet. I think a whole bunch of data without a plan for what to do with it is, well, at least outside of my wheelhouse. I suspect there's probably some pretty interesting machine learning stuff, and I'm looking for the right collaborator to engage with that side of things and all of these kinematic variables as well. So did it work? Well, here we have our controls versus our DCD children. In 2 of our dependent variables, the rate at which they were moving the coins back and forth and the hand path length of their maze. And you can see that we have found significant deficits in rate and their hand path length compared to controls in a couple of our variables, but you can read the writing on the wall here. I'm definitely picking and choosing the ones that worked to present to you out of the 67 variables. The vast majority of them did not show a difference between the groups, largely because the variance in performance, particularly of our dyspraxia group, but also our control group, was so high. And we certainly have nothing approaching the diagnostic sensitivity of either the movement ABC, shown here on the bottom left, or the DCDQ, shown here on the bottom right. But I'm okay with that, right? I think that the first stage of this journey that I'm on with this task was never really about developing something that worked as a diagnostic tool. It was about developing something that kids would enjoy doing that could measure their motor performance and provide us with scores. So now I'm kind of feeling like the next step is to really start to hone in on which of the tests that we have had the best diagnostic potential and start to work with some more experienced video game developers who can develop some more polished more polished systems that will capture data in a more automated way, perhaps using some more interesting modern headsets that invoke mixed reality pass-through to create these really profound mixtures of virtual and the physical environment that take away a whole load of the issues around wearing a virtual reality headset and potentially bumping into a wall and smashing your arm into your teacher or something like that, and providing some really interesting onboarding and instructions. And here with the Meta Quest 3 headset, the newest version of these headsets on the block, you can see I'm playing table tennis in the safety of my kitchen here. And it's pretty easy to imagine this could become an incredibly fun diagnostic tool in a school gymnasium or indeed someone's house. Now, just before I finish up here, I want to give a little bit of a foreshadowing to some other work that's going on, led by a PhD student of mine, Mohammed Al-Harbi, based upon the idea that dyspraxic children are kind of stuck being unable to practice playing sports because they're not in a position where they are socially involved in sports nearly enough. And that sort of vicious cycle of being picked last for football and thus never wanting to play football means that you're never going to get good at football. And we had been sort of seeing virtual reality as a real interesting option to break that cycle where you could practice different sporting skills in your own house. And we had some money and engagement from a developer called Rezel, who have developed a football training system for Premier League football clubs. And they were super keen to work with us in this kind of project. So we, got a little bit of money in the Waterloo Foundation grant to do some PPI work with dyspraxic children to, see if they wanted to learn to play football in this way. And Mohammed got a bunch of dyspraxic children into the lab, taught himself from the ground up how this sort of stuff would work, and got them to give their views about different sports and try out a bunch of virtual reality experiences, including some of these training simulations from Rezel. They're all a bit, overwhelming to sit and stare at on your laptop screen here. So I won't make you look at these for so long. But these are the sorts of things that are supposed to make, Premier League footballers better and, one might imagine, reasonably enough, children better at playing sports as well. But on the whole, and I don't want to make broad generalizations here, there weren't really any kids in our group who we talked to who actually wanted to be any better at football. It was kind of a bit too negatively valenced for them already anyway. And football's a weird one. It's really hard to measure footballing performance. I am in a sports science department and I engage with dissertation students on an annual basis who want to measure footballing performance, but it's not something that really lends itself very well to measuring the performance of well. You can look at how fast people run or how many penalties they can score or something like that, but it's a bit awkward and particularly awkward to put into an intervention kind of context. What kids were super keen on doing, though, was playing Beat Saber, which I had alluded to beforehand. And Beat Saber kind of naturally has this built-in different difficulty levels. If you've not had the chance to play Beat Saber before, you've really got to. It's one of the original and also one of the best things you can do in virtual reality still. It's essentially tricking you into dancing while chopping up these blocks, and you go from being very awkward feeling when you're playing it to really feeling in a feeling of flow like very few other video games have ever got me into before. I'm certainly not quite at the level of that expert on the bottom right there, but you get a sense of what that could be like. And Mohammed has just this week finished data collection from the 30 children with dyspraxia that he has given a VR headset to take home in an intervention study to see if 5 continuous days worth of playing Beat Saber in a semi-structured kind of way for a minimum of 30 minutes a day will lead to better performance than an equivalent tablet-based intervention where they will play cut the rope for 30 minutes every day in terms of their movement ABC scores and also in terms of some other lab-based tests such as the classic box and block test that is often used to look at different motor disorders. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening to me today. This is the first time I've given this talk, and I'm pretty happy that I managed to keep to time just about. And I'd love to hear any questions or thoughts that you might have as well. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Gavin. And so interesting. I've literally got quite a list of questions here that we might hopefully have enough time to work through. But obviously, anybody who has any questions from Gavin, please pop them in the chat or please pop your hand up and skit out loud. So I might as well get started. So you sort of circled back to this at the end. this issue of the social valence factor. Now, it sort of came up as a question for me because I don't know a lot about the research on dyspraxia. I guess I just wanted to know a little bit more about, sort of the existing research on these sort of the impact of these social factors, and could you maybe say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there isn't really a ton of research on this kind of stuff. There has been research looking at outcomes. I would not say there has been really very much research asking children how they feel about stuff. And I think there's been even less research asking adults how they feel about or how they felt about things retrospectively. A bit of this is down to the funding ecosystem, which is largely driven by the Waterloo Foundation. And there's very few other funding agencies that will fund research on dyspraxia because it sits in this weird space between a medical thing and an education thing, with no one really taking very clear ownership over either. And as such, it has, I think, a strange research trajectory that underpins it. And I'm pretty lucky that Mohammed is a PhD student whose government has funded him to do research with children without too many other constraints upon what that ends up looking like, that we've been able to engage in this kind of research. So yeah, I don't have too much more to say on that side of things.
Yeah, I had a feeling that would be the answer. So I can see that Michael and Ori have popped their cameras on, and they're bound to have some excellent questions. So Michael put his camera on first, but Ori's put his hand up first. So I'm going to go to Ori because he's put his hand up.
Thank you. Thanks, Gavin. That was a really, really interesting and inspiring talk. I have two questions. One is about kind of, what do you think about the fact that some children with DCD or dyspraxia has issues with kind of interpreting sensory information and translating sensory information into an action. And in VR, it's always like a tricky thing. I mean, you mentioned it yourself. I'm wondering, how do you think it plays both in terms of diagnosis and how do you treat this compared to the traditional kind of diagnostic tool? And it relates to my second question, whether you think we can take VR a bit beyond diagnosis and take it as a research tool to kind of manipulate sensory information, see how children with DCD kind of use it to translate action. I mean, anything that you think about that kind of
great questions. And I there's a few of us at Exeter doing virtual reality research. I would say we're all doing it with a fairly critical hat on, with a parallel research stream about how do people interact with the world in virtual reality? Because if they're interacting in a fundamentally different way and we're trying to make inferences about their real world performance, well, that's completely broken, right? Now, people have made similar points about working in a research lab versus, doing stuff in the real world as well. And I think that peace has largely been made with that narrative in that context. I think with virtual reality, it's still very, very early days. And this is certainly why I would never want to hang my hat on any subtle kinematic differences. However, differences in performance that seem more like analogous to what we have in the movement ABC, fairly gross measures of performance like number of coins collected, that I'm a little bit more comfortable with having the face validity to the outside world. But there is a massive caveat that we just simply do not know yet. And until that parallel research stream of identifying how our movement kinematics and indeed our perceptual sensory integration changes in the VR headset compared to the physical environment, everything kind of needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. And this would be a purely practical applied tool I'm developing here, with very little to say about the research of dyspraxia or understanding dyspraxia at all. I think that would be a very different and very useful tool to engage with. And then I think also in terms of the differences in sensory integration and how that is used for action, yeah, I mean, totally a great point. Not one that we at all decided to engage with, and we purely decided to go with how much do they enjoy it and does it frustrate them. I suspect we probably could have thought a bit more carefully about the design of our tasks, in particular that is there a table there for you to touch versus no table for your hand to go through, that maybe becomes a real point of frustration, or perhaps a non-point of frustration, depending on which way around things might end up going. But yeah, that was a sort of with hindsight observation that we had.
Cool, thank you.
Michael, do you want to ask your question out loud, or?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So really great talk, Gavin. Really enjoyed that. My question is a little bit theoretical, a little bit practical. So we know with developmental conditions that their age profile can change. And, you can get sort of early emergence or, changing profiles or kind of late emergence. So I'm just wondering, what kind of age do you think that dyspraxia can be diagnosed, should be diagnosed? And obviously that then syncs with the tools you're developing are only going to be appropriate when the kids have got to a certain level in order to use VR, in order to play the kind of games you're using. And the last kind of, it's a bit more technical thing, that the VR headsets are presenting this difference in convergence. It's the kind of thing that gives you a headache, that the screens are there, but you're being required to do convergence of your eyes. And I think the advice is that kids below a certain age shouldn't be using headsets for that reason.
I'll address the second one first, right? Because it's an interesting point. This advice comes from a sense that this would be true, right? Developing visual systems are at some critical point of development. We shouldn't be straining them. But I think in much the same way that, watching TV turns your eyes square and you shouldn't do it too much as a young kid, the narrative from that has shifted around somewhat for a more parental interaction one, rather than a inherently big problem with this on the visual system in small doses anyway. And I think virtual reality is inherently a pretty small dose medium for absorbing different things. The reason they have age limits on VR headsets are all about data protection and North American laws for that, because you can't subscribe a child to something that collects their data when they're under the age of 13 in North America, although that has just changed, and the age limits on the VR headsets have changed as a consequence, which I find amusing. In terms of the first part of your question, I don't know. I would be loath to call myself anything approaching an expert on dyspraxia. I know some kids with it. I've worked now with a bunch of kids and spoken to a bunch of parents who have it. There's not really a whole lot that comes with the diagnosis of dyspraxia, other than a sense of, well, okay, I'm not just rubbish at sports. There's a reason, which, I think is a big part of the underpinning narrative of many diagnostic labels. Often there's a move from using a pencil and paper to using keyboards that is a pretty useful thing, and perhaps a scribe as well, and things like that, or at least a reduction in the time pressures associated with writing at school. But this, these sorts of things often really are just mitigations put in place for dyslexia, rather than anything bespoke for dyspraxia. So I really don't know. I suspect that the challenges that individual children face are probably ones that are pretty easily mitigated by not doing those things anymore, like not riding a bike and not playing football and not writing. And that kind of has its own frustrations, but those frustrations don't go away with the knowledge of being dyspraxic at a young age. I don't know, it's a long and rambling answer, but I really don't know. And it's a great question. And yeah.
Great, thank you so much. I had a question that sort of ran on from Michael's second question a little bit, which was, I wondered if you actually did run into any examples where the VR had any adverse effects at all, like vertigo or motion sickness or anything? No?
No, not in the children, at least. These were pretty short, pretty punchy VR experiences that, apart from the skiing game, are not the sort of things that would cause motion sickness. Things like driving simulators, those are the real disasters, or the roller coaster simulator. But I've not once come across a kid have simulator sickness in VR. This seems to be a bit more of a grown-up thing, but I think even though I put a bunch of kids in VR, this is still fairly small samples, right? And there are definitely going to be kids who do not enjoy being in virtual reality, who do not enjoy the claustrophobic feeling of a thing on their face, do not cope well with this thing slapping around on their face heavily, and also, get a headache from vergence accommodation conflict. And yeah, it just didn't seem to be a chronic or, well, at all noticeable problem in our sample, at least. That's all I can say on that.
Thank you. And seeing as we're coming up to 5, I'll finish with my sort of very practical question, which is about this issue of co-creation and about sort of building these end user needs into the research design. So, thank you for really, discussing and talking us through your experiences and how you sort of conducted your process on this. Do you have any kind of punchy bits of advice on pursuing this kind of research for people in our audience? Something you can sum up in a couple of minutes?
I think what I have really taken from my trainees' experiences with this is that you don't want to do your PPI and then do your experiment. I think that's a sort of incorrect framing. Your PPI is ongoing, and
Right.
there isn't a time you're doing your PPI. I think in the same way that science is an ongoing process, and you haven't done the bit of science at any meaningful point. Sure, we have breakpoints where we write stuff up, or we have breakpoints where we start a new experiment or recruit a sample or put an ethics form in. But I think the framing of PPI before the experiment is naive, right? And is ultimately kind of slightly self-defeating in terms of getting the good value from the PPI, because all of your participants are, people who can give you great feedback on what comes next, and taking that bigger picture, long-term view is really the way to make people feel involved as much as anything else, like they properly are, rather than a tokenistic,
I was going to say it can turn into a bit of a box tick. Oh, I've done my PPI, and now I can forget about it and move on. So that's a really useful thank you way of reframing that whole thing. Brilliant. So we're coming up to 5 o'clock. So unless anybody's got any final burning questions, I think we will say thank you very much again to Gavin for your fascinating talk. And we will wrap it up there for today. So once again,
so
thank
much
you,
for
Gavin.
hosting me.
And we do look forward to hearing from you again in the future, because you said you'd like to come back and update us in a while. So that's brilliant.
Or maybe I'll send Mohammed back to present some of the work from his PhD.
That would be lovely too. Thank you so much. I'll stop the recording.